Okay, girls, this is the immune system, our body's defense against invaders. And like usual, okay, there it goes. So there's three levels at which our immune system operates, right? They're called first line, second line, third line of defense. We're going to do them one at a time. Don't try to understand this whole thing all at once. Innate means inborn, something we have at the moment that we're born. Non-specific means it's a defense that it works against all types of things. It doesn't just work against chicken pox or just against the cold or scarlet fever. It works against all foreigners and invaders. Okay, so these are something that we have from birth, from the beginning, and they work against all invaders. First line of defense is really simple and obvious. What are the things that keep out pathogens? Our skin, our mucous membranes, and special secretions. So let's skip this for a minute. The skin is literally a physical barrier against pathogens, and it also has secretions that ward off pathogens. You don't need to know this, but for example, there's a pH level. That means pH is a level of acidity that discourages bacteria from multiplying. It also has enzymes that digest bacteria. Those are present in the tears and in saliva. Okay, so skin is a physical barrier against all types of pathogens, and mucous membranes are. Don't focus on what this says right now. Just try to recall what you've already learned. If you recall, mucous membranes are cells that secrete mucus, and mucus acts as a stickiness that traps, that captures pathogens, and then they get directed out of your body. So this is really important in the digestive system, in the respiratory system, right? We studied those in depth, how the cilia moves the mucus up and out of the lungs. It's also present anywhere that there's an opening to the outside, including reproductive system, urinary tract. So I made a slide with images of all the places that have mucous membranes. Your sinuses, your nasal passage, your entire respiratory, all the bronchi and bronchioles, your urinary tract, this is the urethra from which you urinate, your eyes, because they have an opening to the outside, these are mucous membranes, your entire digestive tract, from beginning to end, not the liver, just the digestive tract itself, all the intestines, stomach and intestines, they all have an opening to the outside, and so they all have mucous membranes. The one not shown here is reproductive, but same thing for reproductive. Okay, so let's go back. The skin is a barrier. The mucous membranes are a barrier anywhere there's an opening. And then special secretions of the skin and the mucous membranes, most notably found in saliva, in tears, in sweat and oil, skin secretions, are enzymes which kill bacteria and viruses and fungi, any type of pathogens. Okay, so now we go to the second line of defense. So this is like a wall, like a barrier that keeps pathogens out, and it's present continuously, right? Now, if some pathogens get in, these are the three things that kick in. So I hope you remember what phagocytes are. This says phagocytic white blood cells, but you can just call them phagocytes. A phagocyte is something which engulfs by phagocytosis. Let me get a picture because there's no point in, oh dear, I'll have to scroll way down. There we go. Okay, this is a white blood cell. This is a bad guy, pathogen. It gets engulfed, right? Here it's been engulfed now. It bumps into the lysosomes, which are full of enzymes. It gets digested. Pathogen is broken down by enzymes, and it gets spit out by exocytosis. So this process of engulfing is called phagocytosis. And this type of white blood cell is called a phagocyte. The white blood cell which engulfs, digests, and in that way kills all types of pathogens, invaders. Okay. Here we are. So usually I write it as phagocytosis, the process of phagocytes eating up bad guys. The next thing is fever, and then the inflammatory response. So we're going to look at those really briefly. Let me just show you this slide. This slide is super helpful summary. So inborn, non-specific, the ones we just talked about. And this is what we're working on now, phagocytosis, inflammation, and fever. And the last part we're going to get to is here. So, okay, So once pathogens have entered, they've gotten past the wall, they've gotten past your skin or your mucous membranes, the second line of defense begins with phagocytosis. So this is another picture of phagocytosis. The other picture was blue. Here's this yellow blobby thing. The red thing is the pathogen. The same thing is occurring, right? It's getting digested and killing the pathogen in this way. Then is fever, which we're all familiar with. The fever, we're not going to say much about it. All you need to know is that higher temperatures discourage pathogens, discourage viruses and bacteria from reproducing, from proliferating. And that's when they get really harmful. When you're sick, it's because not only do you have some kind of germ, but it's proliferating. So fever, that's all you need to know about it. And lastly, inflammatory response, which is really important. Inflammatory response is a response that occurs when there's any damage or harm to tissue. So inflammatory response is a little bit more complicated. I think this is a good summary. The first thing that happens is, look at this thin little capillary. What does it do? It dilates. Vasodilation. The capillary dilates to allow more blood to flow in and increases blood flow. Okay, so capillaries dilate, increase in blood flow. When blood flow increases, there's also an increase in white blood cells. We'll talk about why that happens. More white blood cells arrive. In this picture, the yellow things are white blood cells. So you see the white blood cells are arriving and they're actually exiting the capillary to go. In this picture here, the little orange rods are the pathogens. Many bacteria have a rod-like shape. So increase in blood flow, increase in white blood cells, and increase in blood vessel permeability. I'm just going to jump ahead to show you what this looks like. When a blood vessel dilates, vasodilation, that's what's occurring, right? It increases the amount of blood flowing. More blood arrives when a blood vessel has dilated. And look what happens to this blood vessel when it dilates. This is the gap between the cells. You see all these little thin lines or gaps between the cells. When the blood vessel dilates, what happens to those gaps? They get larger. So what can occur? Things can slip out. In fact, interstitial fluid leaks out and causes swelling, and many, many white blood cells leak out. Okay, so read through this again, make sure this all makes sense. They all follow logically. As a result, white blood cells and fluids leave the capillary, go to the site of the injury, the spot where the injury is. That means there's lots of phagocytosis of pathogens, because there's lots and lots of white blood cells gobbling up all the pathogens. It also means, since fluids are leaving the capillary, that the increase in fluids causes swelling. Don't worry about this clotting right now. So, vasodilation, increase in blood flow, increase in the permeability of a blood vessel. Permeability means how much things can penetrate or get through. This is just another picture. I don't know if it helps much. I tend to have too many pictures. Yet another one. This is a good way of listing all the things that are occurring. Capillary widening, increased blood flow. Increased permeability, fluid gets released and there's swelling. Attraction of white blood cells, leukocytes is another name for white blood cells, and the white blood cells leak out of the capillary. Okay. The last thing that happens in inflammation is a little bit tricky. It's called chemotaxis. Chemotaxis means that there's a chemical which calls or signals all the white blood cells in your body. They can also be called chemoattractants, these chemicals. Chemoattractants or chemicals are released in the area of the injury, right, where the injury has occurred. And they enter the bloodstream and they attract phagocytes, calling them to the site of injury. This diagram is really weird. I'll explain it to you in a moment. Let me show you. This one might be better. So here is where the injury has occurred. See, someone has been scratched up. This is the bad guys, the bacteria. This cell has realized there's a bacteria and it releases a chemical which spreads all around, spreads to the surrounding tissues, goes into the blood and spreads through the blood. And this chemical is a signaling path to injury site. It's calling white blood cells all over, not just the white blood cells that are right here, but other white blood cells all throughout your body. It calls them to come to the site of injury. You don't need to worry much about this. This is just, it's a weird diagram. This is a white blood cell, and it's showing that as the concentration of the chemical, of the chemoattractant, increases, that's what guides the white blood cell. So that's how it has a direction. They made it look kind of weird, like some kind of car. It looks kind of silly, but the idea is important, that there's a chemical that calls white blood cells to the injured area. Okay, so here's a summary. As soon as there's damage, you don't need to worry about this, but there's chemicals that are released which cause vasodilation, an increase in permeability, and call white blood cells to come to the place of injury. And all these occur. All these cause increase in blood flow, increase in white blood cells, increase in phagocytosis, and all the symptoms that we feel: redness, swelling, etc. So this is a summary you can make on your own. Just make sure you can list each one. And there's one more thing to say about inflammation, because inflammation is kind of complicated. What do you think happens to the flow of blood, of white blood cells, and generally the flow or circulation of fluids? What does inflammation cause about that flow? So, my goodness, where did I answered that question in detail and I can't find where I put it. I had misplaced a slide. So the question was, what happens to the flow of blood and the circulation of fluids in general? So here's what happens. At first, circulation of blood and of fluids increases, right? Vasodilation causes more blood to flow. Blood vessel permeability causes more fluids to flow. But then swelling builds up and the fluid begins to thicken and to clot. This is an actual photograph of a blood clot. This is how your blood clots when you start to bleed. Your blood thickens and then scabs to stop bleeding. It happens also inside your body if there's internal bleeding. So this happens to inflamed area also. Blood begins to thicken and clot, and circulation now slows down. And this is what's amazing. It's a really smart mechanism because it is the mechanism by which an infection is contained. So an infection in your finger won't spread to your whole hand that way. Okay, so this slide is a great summary of everything, right? Here's the first physical barrier. Here's the second, once bacteria or viruses or pathogens enter. Here's the way your body responds. White blood cells gobble them up. The inflammatory response, that complex mechanism, or a fever to discourage the bacteria from proliferating. I have a really silly analogy, which is that of a fortress wall. What would the wall correspond to? It's pretty easy. There's two responses: to your skin and to the mucous membranes. They're like a wall insofar as they're actually an obstacle preventing pathogens from entering, and insofar as they're continuously present. Then the famous image of hot oil being poured over the wall, that would be a way to represent the chemical secretions which discourage bacteria from entering in our tears, in our saliva, in our sweat. And I tried to continue that analogy here. So first of all, these are continuously present, just like a fortress wall. These responses, inflammation, fever, phagocytosis, they respond in a very short time. It can be a question of hours or of a day. Just like archers on the wall are ready and can respond pretty quickly, even though they're not continuous. And lastly, what we're about to do is the most complex. The lymphocytes, the white blood cells called lymphocytes, create antibodies. And this takes quite a while. It's a complex response, which takes days, a number of days. And so I thought the analogy could be like a reserve army that has to be gathered and organized. It's the best and strongest response, but it's kind of a slow response. Okay, so we're going to skip this for a moment, and I want to define some terms to begin the third line of defense. The terms are, all the bad guys are called pathogens, right? Pathogens, just like our cells, have surface proteins. The name of surface proteins of pathogens are called antigens. So these are pathogens, and the surface proteins on them are called antigens. A virus's surface proteins are really famous these days because you always see pictures of coronavirus with their surface proteins, with their antigens. Okay, now we go a step further. This is an antibody. An antibody is a Y-shaped protein. And on its tip, it has something called an antigen receptor or an antigen binding site. So this thing here represents an antigen, a bad guy's proteins, and this is the way an antibody can bind to it. Here's another instance. Here